Okay, today let's talk about policing and punishment. This is a big topic. I say that every time. This is a big topic. There's a lot we could say. We are just going to touch on things in this lecture that, if you're interested, there is a huge literature that can be talked about and you can look into. Not so much in philosophy, at least not on policing. Punishment has been a pretty big topic in philosophical circles. Police have not gotten as much attention from philosophers as, say, soldiers have. There's some, I've had you read it, but certainly there's lots of policy on this. In the School of Public Policy, Dr. Reuter is probably the man to see about issues about policing. But there's a lot of, I think, philosophical depth to the questions that surround policing and punishment, because it is, while philosophers have not tended to focus on policing, the police are the people who do the things that we worry about the state doing. The central problem of political philosophy is often taken to be justifying the existence of something like a state that has coercive powers. And of course, when the state uses those coercive powers outside its borders, it does it through its army. Well, its armed forces. Got Air Force people in this class. I shouldn't use the army as a synonym for armed forces. And inside its borders, it does it with the apparatus of the police and the prison system and the court system. So it's a pretty central question what those kinds of things ought to look like. And today we're going to deal with the internal side of coercion, the question of how a state ought to put together its policies on law enforcement, policing, keeping the peace, and then punishing people who violate the laws. So, big issues. As I said, central issue for this, central issue for lots of political philosophy is, it seems that states, at least sometimes, need to use force to maintain order. If you think that it is good to have something like a state with rules that everyone needs to follow, sometimes it seems we need to use force to make sure that some people follow those rules. Yeah, I mean, that's just the bottom line. We do a lot with convincing people. We do a lot with having laws that people follow for their own reasons. But at the end of the day, it seems, occasionally at least, people are going to break the law unless there is some sort of penalty attached to doing so. And this is where you get things like the Weberian concept of the state, where Weber basically defines the state as an entity with a monopoly on violence, or on legitimate violence. And the reason why there needs to be a monopoly on violence is essentially to keep public order, to make sure that if there is any sort of dispute about what the rules are, the state can step in and end it by force. This is central to Hobbes' account of the state as well. Even to more libertarian thinkers like Nozick and Locke. For Locke, the central problem about not having a state is that most of us have some sense of sort of what the rules of social interaction ought to be. Locke, like a lot of the modern libertarians, thought even in the absence of a state, you have a right to things like your life and property. The problem is, without any sort of coercive force, we tend to be biased towards ourselves. There will be the occasional sociopath who just doesn't care about the rules. And so, between disputes that arise between sincere people who are biased towards themselves and problems that arise from sociopaths who know about the rules but don't care about them, there will be a lot of violence and chaos unless you have a state. What the state brings is the ability to end arguments, end violations of the rules. No sociopath is stronger than the state. If you and I are having a fight about what the rule is, the state can step in and finish that fight. May not be, I don't have to regard it as right, but I will regard it as authoritative. Okay, the problem, of course, is that if we have some even vaguely democratic commitments, or any kind of especially liberal commitments, it's hard to reconcile the possession of this kind of power on behalf of the state with the kinds of things that we tend to make us think the state is legitimate. Utilitarians have the easiest time here, because a utilitarian can just say, look, and this is Hume's argument essentially, look, if living under a state with this kind of coercive power is better for you than not, then, stay. And we build states in a way that maximize the good for everybody. But almost anyone else has sort of a deep problem with this. Liberals, as we talked about before, whether you're a liberal egalitarian or a libertarian or something in between or something other, a very common way of understanding what legitimates the state in liberal theories is through some kind of social contract, some concept of consenting to the state. And we won't recapitulate all of the issues around the notion of consent, but the state's use of force, whatever we think about consent, the state's use of force problematizes that. Because you end up with the question, right? When I decide that I want to steal your stuff, and the police come with their guns to take it back, what can they say to me? Right? If I say, look, no, I don't agree. I do not consent to you using your force to enforce the law. What can they say? We sort of want them to be able to say some variety of, well, yeah, you did. But it's not quite clear how, since it seems like I want to take your stuff without the police punishing me. How is consent involved in that? So, one big question. A second big question is, what exactly are states doing? What is the legitimate purpose of this? What are internal security forces for? Are they there to promote morality? To make sure people do good things? Are they there just to preserve order, make sure people don't fight too much? Do they have some invidious purpose? Are they there to preserve the social hierarchy, make sure that this was Rousseau's view that the state is essentially a swindle the rich play upon the poor? The police are there to make sure that the poor can't get together and rise up and take all of the rich's stuff? I mean, that's not maybe a, well, I don't know, it depends on what you think, right? A lot of people would think that isn't a morally legitimate purpose, but maybe that is what they're for. And if we want to analyze them morally, we at least have to recognize that immoral purpose. So it's not clear, and people inside states dispute about what internal security forces ought to be doing. Once we get past the police, right? Once you are in the custody of the state, you are in its clutches. You violated some rule. We here, probably most of you listening to this here in the modern world, we take it that most people take it as intuitive that you ought to be punished in some way. But here a different set of questions arises, right? What are we doing when we punish you? Are we making you a good person? Are we just setting the scales of justice aright? Are we, inscribing the fury of the sovereign upon your body? What exactly is punishment supposed to be doing? And again, there are, of course, lots of debates about this, and they're relevant to policy, right? They're relevant to questions about how we're going to set the system up. If you think that punishment is about expressing the righteous fury of the community, you're probably going to be a lot friendlier to the death penalty than someone who thinks that punishment is about turning someone from a bad person into a good person, right? It's an obvious example, but there's lots of other kinds of ways that this plays out. And finally, one thing we might ask is, what should the relationship be between coercion and other kinds of ways of solving social problems? Where does the state's ability to coerce us fit into the panoply of other kinds of powers that the state has? All right, so we're going to work through some of these in a horribly inadequate way. So, what are police for? Kleinig worries about this. I think it's a pretty... Once you think about it, it starts by seeming obvious, but then once you think about it, I think it becomes intuitive that there's a big problem about this. There are at least 4 kinds of answers that seem to be floating out there. I'm not going to give you Kleinig supports the 4th, but all of these are plausible, and they're part of the debate about how we should be organizing our police forces and what we should be doing with them. One is that they're there to fight crime, right? This is sort of the most straightforward sort of way of thinking about the police. They're there to fight crime. There are criminals. Criminals do bad things, and the police, they fight them. But even here, there's some complexity involved in this, right? What exactly do we mean, right? We don't literally mean that they go out and fight. I mean, police are not comic book superheroes, right? It's not there because we are edified by the spectacle of police having running gun battles with criminals, right? So one way, there's at least 2 ways of thinking about this. One way of talking about fighting crime that sort of looks ahead is to think about it as, what we mean is they're there to fight the phenomenon of crime, right? We have a police force because it's one of the ways we try to minimize crime. Right? They're not fighting criminals, they're fighting crime. A different kind of way in what seems to be what more people who think of police as primarily to fight crime have in mind is that police are part of the system that ensures the guilty are punished. Right? Police are there to apprehend criminals and hand them over to the people who can punish them for their crimes. So that's one theory, right? That's one perspective on what police are for. They are the people who make sure that, or they attempt to, right? But their job is to make sure that people guilty of violating the law are appropriately punished. They're not the only people who do that, right? But that's their function. It's part of the system that does that. A different kind of perspective is that police are there to respond to emergencies. This might not seem immediately obvious, but it's actually a lot of what police do, right? Police get a lot of in most modern states, police get a lot of fairly generic training on emergency response. We kind of expect police to be able to do basic first aid. And further than that, they're actually, one thing that the police often do is they are often a sort of a gateway into other kinds of state responses, right? So police are often expected to know how, if they find an abandoned child, to know, how to get in contact with social services and get that kid into the system, right? If they find someone who is hurt, how to get them, get an ambulance for them, right? So they're sort of linked into the rest of the social system, and they're the first responders to the emergencies. Now, one reason why you might say, well, why police, right? But one reason this makes sense is that this is really kind of sounds obvious when you say it, but emergencies are often dangerous, right? So the police officers may not be the people who know how to do surgery, but until the surgeons know what's going on and know whether it's safe, folks who are armed, trained in certain generic emergency response skills, and linked into the rest of it are people that we send in first, right? Here you can see a lot of echoes of some of the ways that, especially nowadays, we think about the relationship between soldiers and humanitarians, right? You send the soldiers in, they're not really the people that you want long-term necessarily doing reconstruction. No aspersion on soldiers, right? But that's not their job, right? Their job is typically to be warfighters, but they get some training in reconstruction because they might be the only people who can go in when things are really dangerous and start. And sort of, even if in the long term you want to hand over to USAID or, whatever. Okay. A third way, and this is related to the other kind of way of thinking about fighting crime besides ensuring that the guilty are punished, is that police are there to, use force to preserve order. So their primary role is to prevent outbreaks of violence and disorder and unrest. They're not there necessarily for justice, right? There are other parts of the system, hopefully, right? Ideally, there are other parts of the system that ensure justice, but that, on this view, that's not primarily the police's function, right? if there is a large and unruly protest, it is not the police's function to figure out whether or not the protesters have a point. It's the police's function to make sure that property is not destroyed, people aren't hurt, and that sort of thing. And the primary way they do this is by using force to penalize people who break the order, right? The primary way they do this is by, showing up. If we're talking about small crimes, right? They show up and they're armed and they tell people to stop. Large things like protests, they show up, they have riot gear, they have the right equipment, they have the right training to disperse crowds and this sort of thing through force. So that's a third kind of way of thinking about them. They are, in this sense, they are not necessarily even, fighting crime is part of this, but not all chaos is crime and not all crime is chaos, right? So on this kind of view, the police are probably not the primary. Their primary purpose is not to worry about like white collar crime, like gerrymandering. That's other parts of the system can deal with those sorts of things. There was a brief story. There was a head shop in the city where I was growing up that had all of these water pipes, clearly usable only for smoking tobacco, and there was a big sign in front of them that said, "We cannot sell you anything if you discuss illegal activities while you are looking at these pipes." And because my friends and I were nerds and thought we were horribly clever, we would go in and we would say, I think I'm going to buy one of these fine water pipes and smoke tobacco while I illegally gerrymander congressional districts, right? The this is not a good joke. I'm sorry I was a nerd, right? The ridiculousness of that comment, though, is that it's clearly it's criminal to do things like that, but it's not the kind of crime that we want, that a lot of people think the police are the ones that we want to respond to it. Police respond to breaches of the public order. Similarly, again, things like protests, there are breaches of public order that are not necessarily crimes, right? Or the criminal aspect of it is not the big deal. Okay, so the fourth way, this is Kleinig's preferred way, it may not be yours, is preserving the peace. This is close to using force to preserve order, but the difference is that if we think of police as individuals whose job it is to use force to preserve order, that model thinks of them as we primarily want to use them when the force is appropriate, and we want to focus them on coercive measures. And coercive measures in that sense are sort of a first resort for the police, right? Police are maybe not the first resort for the system, or maybe shouldn't be, but some level of force and coercion is maybe a first resort for police on this kind of model. You call in the police, it's sort of like the SWAT team model, right? You call in the police when you have decided that force is appropriate. And one of the advantages of this view would be that you can sort of focus your police training on force. Kleinig's alternative view is to see police as social peacekeepers. They have a similar goal. Their goal is to reduce conflict and channel what conflict there is into peaceful means, right? Get you to, talk things out or take your dispute before a judge instead of, shooting each other over it or fighting each other over it. But that they're the kind of people who ought to be trained in a wide spectrum of conflict resolution techniques, right? Now, this is going to have elements of some of the other things, right? Sometimes the only way to preserve the peace is to, remove a criminal who is doing something dangerous or disruptive. Sometimes the only way to preserve the peace is to, ensure people that justice will be done for some violation. Sometimes the best way to preserve the peace is to connect people with resources that they need to solve their problems, right? If you have a domestic violence kind of situation, the best way to preserve the peace might be to, link the abused partner up with a shelter, or even to, try to ensure that the two people who are having a dispute are able to get counseling or some other kind of thing. But the core goal is preserving peace. Police on this kind of model are primarily conflict resolvers and conflict transformers. They are not enforcers. Enforcement is a last resort break glass capability in their toolbox, but they should be trained in a wide variety of other kinds of things. On this kind of view, if the paradigmatic image of the police officer who on the model that they are there to use force to preserve order is sort of the riot cop, armored, faceless, intimidating, right? The primary image of the police officer on the social peacekeeping model is like the beat cop who knows everyone in the neighborhood, and that sort of thing, right? If you've watched The Wire, like it's Carver, by the end of the series is the model for the social peacekeeper. He knows everyone in the area. He doesn't have to use a lot of intimidation to get things done because he can just say, "Look, I'm going to call your mom," that sort of thing. Okay. So we have a problem about what police are for. Even on the social peacekeeping model, often one of the goals is to minimize the number of people that have to be punished. But inevitably, it seems, some people will end up having to be punished. So we have a question, well, wait a second. It seems really intuitive. If I say to you without you knowing that we're talking about punishment and philosophy for 45 minutes or so, if I say to you, look, sometimes people just need to be punished, almost everybody's going to nod along, right? Some of you maybe not. You probably already have a theory that tells you not to. But there's a actually really hard question about what exactly we're doing when we're punishing people. On the face of it, you can make it seem pretty weird, right? We say, look, we've got this ritual in our society. When someone steals something, we lock them up, right? Or nowadays imprisonment is sort of the core method of punishment in most Western societies. In other kinds of societies, medieval Europe, right? You say, well, this guy tried to kill the king, so we're going to set him on fire, right? You want to say, well, why? It doesn't. What's the connection, right? Especially when you have sort of these abstract things, right? We're like, well, someone stole something, we lock them up. Someone murdered somebody, well, we lock them up. Someone, did drugs, well, we lock them up, right? It can be a little bit, it can be easy to start thinking, well, wait a second, what is all of this, like, putting people in secure facilities supposed to be doing exactly? Okay, so there are a number of popular theories on this. One is that it is a sort of a balancing of moral accounts. This is the core of what is often called retributivism. Retributivism also often has a kind of symbolic element, so it gets into the next thing. But one idea, in a lot of ways, the idea that's straightforward for a lot of people is that punishment in some sense balances the accounts, right? If you have done something wrong, especially if we think this is not just legally wrong, but evil, right? If you violated a moral obligation, and we can talk later about the connection between moral obligations and the law. It's hugely complicated, and it would take a whole another session to talk about it. But you've done something wrong, you violated a moral obligation, and you should not be allowed to get ahead in that way, right? You've somehow gotten an illicit advantage over other people in the society. And so we need to balance that out. We need to give you a disadvantage to make things equal or fair. Of course, in a lot of ways, the clearest, though one that a lot of us now think is, when I say us, in our society we tend to not want to be quite as brutally literal as this about things, but the lex talionis, the law of an eye for an eye, is sort of the clearest example of this, right? Where, if you kill someone, we kill you, right? If you steal some stuff, we take your stuff. If you hurt someone, we hurt you, we flog you, right? There's a really obvious kind of balancing that seems to be going on here. So that's one theory, that what we're doing when we're punishing people is in some way restoring a moral balance. Okay, a closely related way, and one that's often also part of retributivist, sort of focusing on retribution theories of punishment, is that punishment symbolizes societal judgment. It has what's sometimes called an expressive function. So when we execute a murderer, for instance, we're not balancing any moral account, right? We sort of can't. Executing a murderer does not bring back the people that he or she murdered. It doesn't set things back to the way they were before. Maybe there's some sort of abstract equality, but at least as important to what we're doing, because you might think it's futile if what we're trying to do is balance something we can't balance, is we're symbolizing our societal judgment. Killing murderers is the way we say, we hate murder. Murder is horrible, and we are going to show it by killing these people, right? Similar with other kinds of things, right? We show the societal judgment on things by punishing people. And people can often feel sort of that things are awry, or that things are not being expressed properly if we don't do this. So, for instance, take the fact that the Obama administration declined to prosecute people for being involved in enhanced interrogation techniques / torture, depending on what side of the argument you're on, from folks in the Bush administration. Said, look, we're not going to go after anybody for this. A lot of people felt that that was essentially expressing, we don't care that much about torture, right? That in order to express the societal condemnation of torture, we would need to ensure that people are punished for it. Okay. A third kind of way is to think of punishment as correction, right? Both my parents worked in the New York State corrections system. They didn't work in the New York State flog people system, right? And the idea here is that punishment is a way of disciplining people. It's a way of turning bad people into good people, or at least not quite so bad people. On this kind of view, when we punish criminals, it's very similar to what a lot of people think that they're doing when they punish children, right? You want them to learn that it is the wrong thing to do and then go forth and be productive members of society. A fourth kind of way, and this is often called restorative justice, is that punishment is about redressing whatever harm was done. Right, so this is the kind of model. This model is very different from the core of what we do in European-derived punishment systems, right? But a restorative justice model would be something that would say, well, when people commit a crime, what's bad about it is that someone has been harmed. And so what we should do is, as best as possible, force them to make good on that harm. If they stole something, they give it back. Right, that's a pretty straightforward example, but you know, if they, for harder things, right, if they murdered someone, maybe we require some kind of atonement and reconciliation with the family of the person that they murdered, right? Some way of trying to, as close as possible, set things right with the individual people who are harmed. All right. Now, if you think that all of these things are airy-fairy moral concepts that have no place in the running of a state, you're probably attracted to one of the last of the two fairly attractive visions of what we're doing. One is that, look, none of this matters, right? What we want to do is minimize crime. So we attach penalties to things to deter future violations. It's not an expression of how society feels about something. It's nothing like that. It is just a way of changing people's calculus so they say, I would like to murder that person, but oh crap, if I do, then I will be executed. I prefer to not murder them and not be executed than to murder them and be executed, so I guess I won't, right? It's just about changing the calculus. And very similarly, there's a view, this is by its critics sometimes called the waste management view of punishment, is look, punishment is just about removing dangerous individuals from society. You know, deterrence is kind of scattershot. We gotta hope that people think this through. But if you commit a crime, if you commit a crime, we have learned that you are the kind of person who will commit a crime. And so we just try to, and this is, makes imprisonment look particularly attractive, right? We're just getting you out of society. We're not going to try to punish you, right? Maybe we don't even think you're morally responsible. We just don't want you around. We don't want you endangering other people, so we're going to keep you in a safe area. And there's nothing more, or at least there should be nothing more to punishment than that, right? Folks who have this kind of view, on the one hand, will tend to be really skeptical about rehabilitative efforts, right? Why are we going to teach people? There's something wrong with them. They're just bad. Get them out of society. On the other hand, more humanely, they'll tend to be also really skeptical of retribution, right? There's no point in inflicting unnecessary pain. For folks who have this kind of model of punishment, criminals are to be treated very similarly to the way we treat, like, mental patients who something has gone wrong with their brain that makes them a danger to themselves or others. It may not involve any moral judgment, it just means they're dangerous. Okay. So, all of these different views imply different views about the role of force in the maintenance of the state. A lot of people intuitively think of force as sort of a last resort. And a lot of those views do place force in a last resort kind of place. If you have, if you are an extremely squishy, wet liberal, you're probably going to say, oh man, social peacekeeping plus rehabilitation, that seems like the way to go, right? There, you're probably going to want to minimize force as much as possible and really reserve it for, situations where it is absolutely the only way to prevent harm from coming to people. But not all of these views actually do relegate force to a last resort. Expressive theories of punishment, for instance, don't relegate force to a last resort. Force is part of the point of an expressive theory. It would be weird to say, we want to punish people to show how angry society is at what they have done. But, harming them is an absolute last resort. No, harming them is the point, right? You can't flog people while retaining flogging for a last resort. So, contrary to, I think a lot of people, if you ask them on the street, is force a last resort, they would say yes. But especially once we move to the punishment system, force is sometimes part of the point of what you're doing, not a emergency adjunct to what you're doing. Foucault, in his discussions of medieval punishment, thought they had a very expressive function, right? All of these spectacles of execution, if you go read Foucault, don't do it while you're eating, he'll talk about it, sort of all of these incredibly creative and gruesome punishments that were thought up for people who, tried to assassinate kings and that sort of thing. The point of the gruesomeness is not a regrettable means to the end, right? The gruesomeness of these things is the point, right? It's the sovereign inscribing his fury upon the body of the person who has violated the sovereign law. Similarly, if you are a supporter of the death penalty, killing the person is the point, right? That's how we express our anger at what they have done, is by killing them. It's not that, we would like to express our anger, and unfortunately the only way to do it is by applying force to their body. No, the killing them is the point. Okay. So that's one way in which this plays out. It's sort of, where do you think force fits into things? Do you think violence could be the point of some practices? There's a proportionality issue. What you think our social aims are with our internal coercion institutions will affect how much force you think is appropriate for them. So you can see this play out in some of the arguments about, for instance, how to deal with things like protesters, right? A lot of law and order types will basically say, look, these people are disruptive, whatever. You need to pepper spray them or round them up like they shouldn't be out making problems for good, honest folk. If you think of it as a sort of if you're more focused on kind of social justice and social peacekeeping, you'll be saying, well, no, we should talk to them, we should have good police liaisons and that sort of thing, right? So what you think is proportional depends to a large extent on what you think the goal of our policing and punishment institutions is supposed to be. An adjunct of this is, there are two adjuncts of this, right? One is that using coercion in whatever way in the domestic context really in a lot of ways bottoms out as a matter of how we think it is appropriate to distribute risk between citizens, between potential violators and people we think might be violators and non-violators, between areas of the country, between areas of populations, and between police and non-police, right? So questions like, how much risk should we expect police to take upon themselves when they enter dangerous situations? Because often it is a trade-off. Often police are able to use less force if they're willing to take more risk on themselves, right? Sort of a force protection issue. But also things like distributing risk between citizens come into things. Philip Pettit gives a little sketch in one of his pieces about how you can end up with extremely punitive and possibly sort of over-punitive punishment systems even when almost everybody agrees that they are not socially optimal. And it has to do with distribution of risk, right? So in the US, we have a system of parole where, if you have served a portion of your sentence, but you have, not committed any additional violations while you're in prison, you've been generally on good behavior, you show remorse, all these sorts of things, you can be allowed out of prison under supervision for the remainder or a portion of the remainder of your prison term. Most people in the abstract say, yeah, that's a pretty decent system, right? This is something that there's wide support for the system in the abstract. The problem is this. It's actually very hard to get parole in most states. Most states have, there's a parole board that will issue a recommendation about parole, but then this goes before the governor of the state. Probably not literally before the governor in every case, but before someone in the governor's office for review. And the state executive can deny parole despite a positive recommendation of the parole board. The reason why it ends up being hard to get parole is that there's no upside for them to grant parole. Because if they grant parole and the person does nothing, right? Nobody counts up the number of parolees who didn't commit additional crimes. No governor gets reelected by saying, look, I let out thousands of people from prison and none of them committed additional crimes. Yay! Right? We all sort of in the abstract, I don't know about all of us, but most of the people in the abstract would say, yeah, that would be great, but we don't, that's not what wins elections. On the other hand, if even one person gets out on parole and then commits some horrible crime, or even a not so horrible crime, but something, that's going to get noticed. And so the de facto policy ends up being that people pretty much don't get parole, or it's at least very difficult to get parole. And so a lot of this has to do with how we think it is equitable to distribute risk in society, right? The system we have in the US predominantly now lowers the risk to individuals who are outside the prison system at the cost of keeping people in prison longer than maybe sort of morally optimal. More than we would maybe want to say in individual cases, right? It's shifting risk from the sort of non-incarcerated population onto the incarcerated population. A lot of people think that's fine, right? And because we say, well, look, people have committed crimes, maybe we should shift the risk there. But there's a question there about where exactly should this go. The other corollary, of course, is that non-lethal force can still be harmful and/or humiliating. So there was the infamous case of Lieutenant Pike at University of California who pepper sprayed at close range protesters. No one's going to die. Well, I mean, people can, right? But nobody died from being pepper sprayed there. Yet, I really, really would not have wanted to be one of the people who got pepper sprayed. So one thing to keep in mind is that there can be a tendency to identify non-lethal uses of force with sort of non-use of force when they're actually quite different and quite possibly very morally different. There's a big difference between a police officer non-violently stopping a crime by negotiating and calming the situation down, and a police officer non-violently stopping a crime by pepper spraying everybody until they fall down. Okay. One connection issue, I'm going to run through this really briefly because this is another big topic, is whether we should see crime as a moral evil, a moral failing, or a kind of pathology. The problem is this. Most of us intuitively kind of think of it as a little bit of both in a way that's not necessarily coherent. The problem is if you want to see crime as just an evil, then you risk ignoring social and economic drivers of crime, right? It suddenly looks a little bit weird, like, man, you know, why are people who live in poor urban centers so much more evil than people who live in wealthy suburbs? Right? It seems probably not intuitive that the entire difference between, you know, the levels of crime in wealthy suburbs and the levels of crime in inner urban centers is just because, you know, more evil people happen to be born in one place than the other. So it seems like there's at least something else going on with crime than just individual moral failings. This has led a lot of people, especially some public health folks who work on crime and violence, to say, well, look, crime is essentially, it's like a social disease, right? It's not an individual moral failing. It's like a social disease. It's like a mental pathology. On the other hand, if you see crime, the concern is that, the pushback is, if you see crime as just a pathology, this really risks dehumanizing people. It risks treating them not as people who make choices, but as, you know, animals or pawns or, you know, whatever, right? You're essentially saying to someone, you know, maybe you're avoiding the pitfall of saying, hey, you must be committing crimes just because you are randomly evil, and we will punish you with no regard to your circumstances. But the other side of the pendulum swing also is problematic, because you're essentially saying, oh, you know, you're not a person at all, right? You are purely a mechanical expression of your circumstances. And the same way that people who resist the characterization of crime as a evil want to say, look, could it really be that there are just more evil people in you know, in inner cities than there are in wealthy suburbs? People who resist seeing crime as primarily a pathology say, well, look, it's not like everybody in the inner city commits crimes, right? What explains the variation? Are you just you know, if you just say, well, there must be some micro variation in their environment, well, you know, prove it, right? So there are problems with both sides of the pendulum, but if you want to sort of throw your hands up and go, well, it's a mix of both, right? That's not. There are difficult questions about free will involved in trying to make those two views coherent, taking account of both kinds of aspects of things. Now, the policy problem, right? So this isn't just a worry that philosophers have about free will. The policy problem that this gives rise to is that evils and pathologies seem to have different appropriate responses. It doesn't make any sense to punish someone for their pathology, right? It might make sense to sort of keep them away, to keep people safe, but it doesn't make any sense to punish them. So, you know, Kennedy talks about this, right? If people are evil, then it's plausible to punish them. You don't punish diseases, right? If crime is primarily a pathology, we are not responding appropriately in most Western countries to it. You know, as Kennedy points out, right, if you really think crime is a disease, like when you have cancer, we don't bust down your door and shoot the dog, right? When we have cancer, we get you into treatment, hopefully. There's all sorts of stuff we do about crime that does not make sense if we think it is primarily a disease. On the other hand, if you think crime is primarily a disease, typically what your policy response is going to want to be is, well, try to address the root causes, try to address the vectors of this disease. You know, if you think, for instance, that crime is very closely connected with poverty, say, okay, well, let's eliminate poverty, right? Well, but addressing root causes of crime is slow. We're not going to eliminate. I can throw a murderer in jail today. I can't eliminate poverty today. It's difficult, right? If we really wanted to and knew exactly how to eliminate poverty, we would have done it by now. So whichever way you think it's difficult, it's either difficult to do or it's difficult to convince everyone that we ought to be doing it. And it involves political and moral controversy, right? If you really want to address root causes of crime, you're going to end up in conversations that don't sound like they're about crime at all, right? We might start by agreeing, yeah, crime is bad, let's stop it, and end up by arguing about like whether or not we need to smash capitalism and usher in a communalist state, right? So there's a lot of deep moral and political controversies that you end up embroiled in if you want to address root causes rather than just saying, let's stop crime. Okay. I would like to teach an entire class on this, but it's a lot to say. Alright. We should at least address one of the cynical analyses of policing and punishment that is popular, which is that all of this talk about sort of what's the best thing to do, how do we arrange this so we meet our moral goals, all of this is naive and beside the point, because policing and punishment is there to enforce social hierarchy. There are different views of this. Some views are conspiratorial. Essentially, they believe that this is there's not necessarily a secret plot, but that this is an explicit purpose, right? The people who are in power want to do this. They think of themselves as doing this. Possibly more congenial are views like Alexander's, where this is not a conscious thing. Alexander points to some evidence elsewhere that there are some conscious elements of this, right? But primarily it's not a matter of conscious desire to enforce social hierarchies, but a system that reproduces them, even if the individual people in the system are not thinking of it that way, right? So most police probably do not go out their door and say, it's a beautiful day to defend the privileges of the rich. I want to maintain economic inequality today, right? But if the system is set up in a particular way, that might be what they end up doing regardless. There's a number of ways this can play out, right? The core element that a lot of people worry about is that police are at least no less biased than anybody else in society. And the fact that they have access to tools of violence and lots of discretion and power means that their bias has more powerful opportunities to show itself than a lot of other people's. There's a couple ways that this can play out. Both police and legislators have a lot of power, a lot of discretion, and no less bias than anybody else. So, laws. Police may see themselves as neutrally and impartially enforcing the laws, but the laws themselves might reflect a social bias. In the United States, one of the examples that's often brought up of this is sentencing disparities between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. They're basically chemically the same stuff. They have the same kind of effects on the people who take them. One of the main differences is that crack cocaine is primarily associated with African American users. It's cheaper. And powder cocaine is primarily associated with white people in 80s movies about Wall Street. So if you have the same amount in the United States, if you have the same amount of crack versus the same amount of powder cocaine, you will go to jail for a lot longer for the crack. Obama reduced the sentencing disparity, but only from sort of a factor. I think it was from a factor of 10 to a factor of 4. So police might impartially enforce the law, but there's going to be end up with a lot more black people in prison if they impartially enforce a law that reflects a social bias. The other kind of way this can play out is that laws might privilege social order over justice. So when the large Occupy encampments were sort of rolled up by the police, in a lot of cases the the violation that was used as the reason for going after the protests was that they were illegally camping, right? And a lot of people point out, illegal camping is not normally high on the list of enforcement priorities for police departments. In Baltimore, they rolled up the Occupy Baltimore encampment on the theory that it was a public health hazard. It was unsanitary and unsafe and public health hazard. This got a lot of outcry because Baltimore is notorious for instance, not going after slumlords who own abandoned properties that are public health hazards. Right. Around the same time they were rolling up Occupy Baltimore, several abandoned buildings with multiple building code violations collapsed into the street. Like, unfortunately, no one was hurt, but into the street and sidewalk in South Baltimore. So. One argument is that the way the laws are set up and the priorities that people have in enforcing them reflect a concern with maintaining order and existing hierarchy rather than with trying to channel social disputes in a productive manner, right? And the ideals that we have, the whole concern about this is that the ideals we have about policing and punishment may not, if we only focus on the ideal when we're doing our moral analysis, we may miss the actual social impact of the institutions, right? If all we think about is what ought police be for, we may miss the way in which that's not how things work in real life. As I'm recording this, for instance, one of the things that one of the cases that's going to the Supreme Court has to do with the use of drug-sniffing dogs. Right. The problem is, in our actual society, so you might think, okay, we train dogs to be able to smell out drugs. We know dogs have a pretty good sense of smell. If dogs smell drugs, that's a pretty good, it's not 100%, but, we have rules about police in the United States not being able to search you just because they want to, and those are good. But surely if the dog smells something out, that makes sense then to let them search you. The dog might be wrong, but at least gives you a good reason. If you think about it in the abstract, that all sounds very reasonable. In the real world, one of the problems is that it turns out dogs want to please humans. And police officers who are biased, even unconsciously biased, right? They're not thinking, ha ha ha, let me lock up some black people today, right? They just have unconscious bias, and if you think you don't have unconscious bias, I encourage you to take the implicit association tests you can do online. Most people have unconscious biases that are not in line with our conscious beliefs about people. So it turns out that police who have unconscious biases, right, who maybe are subconsciously associate drug use more with black people, dogs are really good at picking up on cues. The dog will be able to there's evidence that the dog will pick up on the fact that the police officer is more worried about this person. That will make the dog more tense, and the dog will be more likely to act as if it's found drugs, right? Because the dog wants to make you happy, right? The dog knows you want to find drugs, and the dog wants to make you happy. So in the actual world, the concern is that drug-sniffing dogs, as reasonable as they sound, and is in line with sort of ideals of balancing privacy against enforcement that we might have, might actually function as ways of laundering the implicit biases of police, right? If you don't take into account that in the actual world, police are people who have all the biases people have, you might end up talking only about the ideal and miss the moral import of how things actually play out. Okay. So, all of this kind of only matters for a policy perspective if we have any alternatives. And the core of many arguments for not radically reforming our police and prison systems is, well, what the heck else are we going to do? There are lots of people who look at the current systems of policing and imprisonment, especially in a place like the US, where we have a massive, sort of a massively swollen prison population, and some really credible concerns about racism in the way that our policing and our punishment is carried out. To say, well, look, we've got to reform what we have. Certainly we should fix problems with it, but we can't radically change it because what else are we going to do? How else are we going to keep social control? We can talk about which ones of these might be adequate, but it's hard to do anything besides being a moral philosopher spinning your wheels unless you are willing to think seriously about what actual alternatives are there and how could we implement them, and would they be better than what we have, right? It's one thing to compare. The flip side of you need to take account of the moral import of the actual institutions is that it's unfair to compare problematic performance of actual institutions with your ideal wish list performance of how the thing that you're imagining as an alternative would work in a perfect world, right? You've got to think about, well, how would this work in the real world? So there are some options out there. Maintaining order, there's a lot of interest in mediation and violence interruption. There's a very very intriguing film called The Interrupters, made by PBS, about a program that was developed in Chicago called Ceasefire, that deploys essentially people with connections in the gang communities to defuse situations on the spot between gang members, right? The idea is that most violence is not calculated and premeditated violence, even criminal violence. Most of it is angry people with limited emotional resources and weapons. So if you can go in and kind of nip those things in the bud, then you can avoid at least a lot of the violence involved. Kennedy, who you have one of the readings from, he is one of the pioneers of a confusingly also called Ceasefire, but totally different model, and there's some East Coast West Coast thing between them, developed as part of the Boston Gun Project, which uses similar kinds of things. We can talk about this, but one of the main distinctions is that the Boston Ceasefire model involves police. The Chicago Ceasefire model eschews the involvement of police as problematic. Anyway, you can look at those root causes. You can try to reduce poverty and ameliorate the social system. This is essentially the strategy of many anarchists. Many folks who think we don't need a coercive state at all, their argument is basically, if we had a more egalitarian society, if we had a society that was less socially dysfunctional, you would not need a police force, right? You would reduce crime to the very small number of sociopaths, and we could deal with them. Or especially for things like a huge proportion of the American prison population is there because of drug crimes. So especially in that context, one way of trying to maintain order is decriminalization of certain violations. Stopping treating them as criminal violations, treating them as pathologies. Or, this is clearly applicable to drugs, but this kind of approach has been suggested for other kinds of things. Prostitution, for one. A lot of European countries have decriminalized prostitution, and the theory was that it's not the prostitution we care about, it's not the sex work we care about, it is, the illegal trafficking in women, the violence, and that all of these things, things like the illegal trafficking and the violence and, drug use and all sorts of things that we do maybe care about more directly are functions of the fact that prostitution is a black market. And if you, decriminalized it, then you wouldn't have the other side effects, right? So if we're concerned primarily with maintaining peace, maintaining order, lots of decriminalization policies potentially look attractive. Many of them may still have drawbacks, right? But at least puts them on the table. What if we care about balancing moral accounts? There, remember, at least in some versions of this, the violence is the point. It is not an unfortunate side effect. Well, there are different kinds of ways that people have tried to think through this besides the kind of combination retributive, rehabilitative waste management system that a lot of Western countries have. The U.S. leans a little bit more towards retribution and waste management. European systems tend to lean a little bit more towards rehabilitation, but they're all kind of a mix. People suggest lots of things. Restitution, community service, reconciliation programs. This is tied in with the restorative justice approach. Shaming or marking. In most Western countries, things like branding people or making them wear scarlet letters or publishing their names, putting them in stocks, these sorts of things are we tend to think of them as brutal, but a lot of people have said, well, look, are they more brutal than putting them into a prison? Corporal punishment, similarly, right? We hear about people being flogged, and we go, ugh, but a lot of people say, look, if you really understood how the prison system works, maybe you would think it's more humane to just, flog someone 15 times in the public square and then let them go their way. Or, of course, if you are skeptical of the whole balancing of moral accounts, you might just say nothing. We replace balancing moral accounts with nothing. We maintain order and then we don't care about the other stuff, right? This is popular with people who are a popular approach to things that are sometimes called victimless crimes. Again, drug use and sex work are high on the list in a lot of Western countries for this. You might think, look, if somebody says to you, a lot of people, if somebody said, well, look, but what do we do about the fact that drug use is evil, right? And you shouldn't do it. They say, well, we do nothing about that, right? That's individual views about things. We don't care. Other people think this applies to the whole thing, right? What do we do about the fact that murder is evil? Besides minimizing it, what do we do about it? They say, well, we do nothing besides minimize it. Okay. And of course, with any of these, you might have a role for a question of, well, what role, if any, do you have for formal police punishment correction institutions in a system where we used more of these alternatives instead of the kinds of things that we currently use? All right. So, to sum up, run roughshod over a whole lot of different questions, but to sum up very briefly, there are several possible understandings of the relationship between force and the social contract. There are different ways of thinking about what police are doing and why we should be regarded as having consented to them, as having accepted them as part of our system, right? If you think that retribution is the best way of thinking about it, maybe you think of it as being accepted because part of the contract is I say, no one, including me, ought to be able to get an unfair advantage. If you think of them as primarily rehabilitative, then the consent is in a similar way to the way we work out consent for children or people who have mental problems, right? We are, when you are punished in a rehabilitative manner, maybe the way we should regard it is that it's being done for your own good, even if you don't recognize it at the time, and sort of deal with the consent issue that way. How the relationship is understood is, of course, going to shape what kinds of policies we think are good for police and punishment. Even if you are not talking about radically reshaping the system, there are people who are prison abolitionists and that sort of thing, but even if you're not that radical, it's going to affect things like, how do you think we should set up parole and pardon systems, right? How should we deal with protests and other kinds of unrest? What kinds of things should be criminalized or decriminalized? And finally, the import of some of the cynical analyses is that there may, unfortunately, be, to some extent, a tension between preserving order and promoting justice. If an order is unjust, obviously, it may be necessary to go through disorder to make it more just. But the basic assumption of most sort of mainstream thought on policing and punishment is that the appropriate way to make the order more just is to work through legal, non-violent, non-disruptive means to do so. This, of course, places a lot of weight on how good you think those systems are, right? And brings us back to all these questions about democracy and legitimacy and participation. The idea that that it is morally unproblematic to have an institution that uses coercion primarily to maintain order without asking itself questions about justice, or with relegating those questions about justice to a different part of the system. The plausibility of that view depends very heavily on how much you trust the other parts of the system to ensure that it is at least basically just.